If you're just joining me, my special guest today, very special guest, is Conrad Wolfram. And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share these with your friends, because the more we can get the message out there, the better, especially the message today. The message today is one of the more important messages maybe of the century. And I know that sounds like hyperbole, which is a math term, but today's guest is Conrad Wolfram, who has made it his mission to be kind of like that voice in the wilderness, to say that not only are we getting things wrong about education, which we all kind of know we're doing because the test scores keep getting worse and worse, but he's saying it's really not about the test scores. It might be about the subject we're actually testing, that we should put that rigor that we put into launching rockets into space and trying to fix our economies and trying to save everybody from disease. We should put that rigor into, or that what he might call that computational knowledge or process, into thinking about the actual subjects we teach children. And he's done that with his team, and they just came out with a book last year. Has it been a year yet, Conrad?
It has been a year, yeah. Slightly over a year.
Happy anniversary.
Time flies.
And he's written a book called The Maths Fix. And of course, if you have any British friends, you know they call it maths. And this is kind of a play on words Conrad did, because
that's why the S is in parens, by the way.
It's in parens, yes. So he knows the difference.
And also, it's a function of the S's, but that's an in joke.
It's an in joke, yeah. Well, and because he's going to point out that there might be a plurality of maths out there, truly. And just a little bit about me, Wolfram. I'm right down the road from. I just called you Wolfram. I'm right down the road from Wolfram Research in Champaign. We're in Galesburg. We're just about an hour and a half away, 2 hours away. And I have friends who work there, like Oleg, the Russian, who's a genius. And I have many friends there who work there or continue to work there. And it's a joy to have that kind of a company in Illinois. Illinois is kind of a small little tech corridor itself. People don't know about that. And Wolfram Research is one of the feathers in our cap. So I'm glad you're here. But please, why don't you tell the audience, if you could, what you're all about, if you would.
So thanks for the intro, by the way, and lots of different things there that I sometimes don't get. And I wish I'd be back in Illinois, hopefully soon. Look, I guess for 30 plus years, my brother and I have been trying to push the boundaries of this amazing thing called computation. And what we've been doing is to try and figure out how we use that to empower humans to do better decision making. And it's been, tremendously successful. We've just seen some of the consequences, positively, I should say, of trying to deal with this pandemic, for example, in trying to figure out how we compute better outcomes, etc. And there are some mistakes there too. So that's what we've been doing for 30 years, trying to push the boundaries of what can be done. And the day job is to try and do that by optimizing the technology, getting the computing power so we can really calculate more and more things more easily at higher level, more automated, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the original product was Mathematica, widely used across universities and corporations and everything to do high level computations. Then in 2009, we launched Wolfram Alpha, which is like what we call a knowledge engine. So instead of doing search like Google or something, it tries to compute new knowledge when you ask it a question. So different kinds of answers that you get. So all of that has meant that I've been looking at the human quotient of this. It's like we're making technology better and better and better, and hopefully that makes life easier for the humans so that we can get better answers. But then you start looking at it and you say, well, actually, to get what we really need, the humans need to step up too. And we've got this new AI era where, computers are sharing some intelligence with us. And the question is, what is it that we need to learn as humans to do better in this world? We can just sit there and do the same things, but in the end, the computers are going to take over more of those things, but we could actually step up to another level. And right at the center of this is this whole era of computation, which in school is math. Right? Math is the mainstream computational subject we're all forced to learn for many, many years of our life. And the more I've looked at this, the more I've realized it's just kind of diverging from what we need in the real world really fast. So we have the real world computational thinking, as I would call it, that we desperately need people to use and to know and to figure out how to work with. And then we've got math in schools, which everybody's saying, hey, it isn't good enough. Not enough people are doing it right. Complaints everywhere. And we just need to step up what we're doing with that and push harder. And the more I looked at this, the more it was like, hang on just a moment. However much we step up on this, it's not going to meet the divergent computational thinking we need in real life. And so I set about trying to figure out, okay, so what do we need? And the more I've looked at this and worked with this, the more I've seen the subject is really a problem. And as a mainstream subject, we need to do something very different. And that's what, as Mike introduced, that's what, that's really what we've been working on for the last, 10 or 11 years at this point, to figure that out and to try and deliver it.
Right. And you say you went to first principles, which I find interesting. I'm a big Elon Musk fan. So I find it fascinating when people have do these processes of optimization where they try to improve, and they actually think about the process of improving and they optimize that as well. And you've come up with your, I call it Dachi. Right. My staff is like learning all about your book because these papers are all over our office. I do the Italian pronunciation of Dachi, and because that's how I think. I'm Acerra. So it's define, abstract, compute, interpret. And I threw this at some of my math friends. Are like, what? Well, what does he mean by that? And they're like kind of diving into that themselves. Like, so I think by the abstraction process, he means like putting it into numbers, into equations, perhaps. And define is like even figuring out what the nature of the problem is. Even be able to say the problem sometimes is a very important part. But what you were suggesting was on these four things right here, these processes, we overemphasize the computing part, and that's what the computer machines are doing. And you said it's always a historical mistake to compete with machines because we always lose badly.
Well, so, certainly machines that have been successful, and computers have been unbelievably successful.
Right. So successful, we don't even know we're using them anymore.
Right, indeed. Yes.
So why don't you tell us about this process? Because I think that one of my questions also was, what can you say that would put at ease all the stakeholders that you're kind of threatening, like the principals, superintendents, parents, kids, teachers, because I think this goes a long way to maybe putting them at ease if you are able to let us know what this means.
So look, one question that everyone who's done, look, we're all forced to do years of math at school, right? You'd hope you'd know after doing that with clarity what the process is that you're running. I mean, math is a problem-solving process. That's what it is in the end. It's a way to solve problems. Sometimes you want to solve very practical problems. That's what actually we're mostly trying to train people for. Sometimes if you're a keen mathematician just for its own purpose, you want to solve more abstract problems just for, because you're interested in those abstract problems. But whichever it is, it's a process. Now, the question is, understanding that you're operating within a process and trying to improve that process is very important, as part of the education into this subject and how you use it. And that process, we think, is basically, you can summarize mostly as this 4 steps. The Dachi, that I actually haven't pronounced it that way before, that you put up. And just to walk through this, the first step of defining is where you're trying to take a real world problem you've got. I mean, when I'm giving talks, when I'm allowed to give talks again in real life, I often say, a typical definition would be, if we lock this room down, and I'm making various conditions here, and switch off the air conditioning, et cetera, how long can we survive if I just go on talking for too long? So that might be a definitional step. And of course, there are lots of things you might consider. Well, what do we mean by survival? What's going to go wrong first? We're going to run out of air, food. Well, it might depend. For most people, it might be air, but then for some people, let's say if they're diabetic or something, they might have other things that need handling first. So it isn't necessarily it isn't one problem you're setting out there. But let's take the central thing, run out of air or something. So then the abstraction phase, step 2, you're taking this sort of English of that and you're turning it into math, what we're familiar with, algebraic symbols or, some equation or whatever. Actually, there's a much wider range of things you can turn it into than you're taught at school. And actually, the way you write that down in the modern world is code. This is the link with programming. Because how are you going to write down what it is you're abstracting to? It's
an if-then statement almost. If the rate of oxygen depletion is 5 liters per hour, and there's you could, I'm seeing that.
Well, I mean, there are various ways you might decide to abstract this. There may be different algorithms. You might decide it's a machine learning problem. But whichever way it is, you're trying to set it up. Now, why are we doing this? We're doing this because math, I mean, one of the great achievements of if you like, the language of math is that it forces lots of different, apparently disparate things we might want to work out into this precise language. And this precise language has hundreds of years worth of ways to use it to compute a real answer that's precise. And so we've got this fantastically powerful system, which just doesn't work in a traditional human language. That's why we abstract. That's why we do this step 2. It's a difficult step, by the way, which we don't practice enough. Mm-hmm. So then you've got something like, let's say we have an equation. And the step 3 is we're taking the question in this abstract form that we've set up, and we are then turning it into an answer in the abstract form using these hundreds of years worth of logic that's been figured out about how you transform questions to answers in this system. And then step 4 is we say, okay, we got the answer. Let's say x equals 3. And what does that mean back in the question we set? Well, maybe it means 3 hours, okay? And is that a reasonable answer? You know, let's verify it. Can we check it some way? If not, do we want it more precise? Let's go around the whole process.
And you can see how some people might be really keen at interpreting, right? And some people might be really keen at, I use the word keen, of defining. Like I could see different people having different strengths.
Yes, absolutely. And we all need to have a certain amount of all the strengths. What we need the least of is knowing how to take that computation and do it by hand.
Right.
Because the computers, I mean, the hint's in the name, right? Computer.
Right.
It's pretty good at that. In fact, it's billions of times better than any of us are. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean we have to completely ignore it. As I say, we have to interpret, we have to verify. If you put the wrong thing in, or you make a mistake somehow how you specify a problem, you're going to get the wrong answer, or you may make a mistake in your assumption. So there's actually a lot more understanding that you need, but it's very different understanding from what we're teaching in traditional math curricula. It's not, did I slip a minus sign in the middle of my calculation? It's, did I forget an assumption when I defined this? Did I abstract it to a tool set that's not really going to work for this problem, is going to give me garbage answers? Did I not interpret it appropriately for the situation so that in the end, I'm getting a bad decision? Or I think the decision is more precise than actually it can be in real life. So these are the many steps with real complex problems that we're mostly not doing in the education system, because the steps 1, 2, and 4 of that process, we're mostly doing far less of than we need in real life as a human. But we're doing more of step 3, but on much more simplistic problems that we never actually want to solve in real life as humans anyway. And if we did want to, we'd give them to the computer.
Right. You talk about, and I love this, and I think I'm thinking right now of the movie The Martian, in the book, messy problems. And you love messy problems because the real world is full of messy problems. And like you just said, mathematics is full. Even I went to aerospace engineering, 2 years of aerospace. I flunked out after differential equations. I became an art major. But even then, the problems, some of the trig problems were problem solving, but still they were prepackaged problems with a prepackaged answer, right? Multiple choice, whatever it is. But that's not messy. How would you describe messy, and why should kids be exposed to messy?
Okay, it's a great question. I mean, let me strip this right back. I'm going to go in at this from various angles.
Okay.
So if you want to decide there's a mainstream subject at school that everybody has to do, you better make sure that it's somehow empowering to most of the folks who take it. Right. So, I mean, that's kind of my starting point. Mm-hmm. We have decided that math is such a subject. Now, in the real world, how do you actually use math? Well, you use it, as I say, for better decision making. The decisions you're trying to take are on messy problems. I mean, almost all the time. I mean, yeah, you can do bits of arithmetic, but even that's a setup problem. You always got a piece of, nowadays you've got a phone or you've got some computer with you. That the issue is not the calculating. The issue is setting up the problem and defining it. Or the issue is understanding where you can interpret this. So the issue we've got is we want to match education with what's actually required in the real world. And what's actually required is always pretty much messy. In fact, here's the thing that's amazing, which some of the mathematicians get very annoyed with me for saying this. But math wasn't that useful in most subjects until computers liberated it from hand calculating. So if you think about where math got used before computers, it got used in accounting, It got used in physics,
astronomy,
where
maybe.
there were very clean issues, bits of astronomy, where it turned out you could use with relatively small amounts of calculating. All these clever techniques were used for getting round calculating. But it wasn't used in any biological sciences much because too messy. It wasn't used in what we now call data science. It wasn't really used in what we now call high-level finance, you know, where we're doing complex analyses in that way. All of that is post-computer. And it's very simple. Why? Because you just can't do this without a computer. There's too much calculating. So math actually had a much more limited scope before it was liberated by computers. So that's the position in the real world now, and we're pushing the boundaries further with more AI and the rest of it. So therefore, if you strip out computers from education for the subject, you will strip out almost all the context that people might use the maths for in the real world. And so you end up with these toy problems in these, you know, it's snooker balls. I don't know what you get in the US. We got, you know, I don't know, things that you can happen to calculate, you know, snooker balls on a table. You know, oh, I can't even remember, you know, some very simple problems that happen not to be messy. And people say, you know,
so they have to make they have to make a new world around this math.
Yes.
A cartoony world. Yeah.
It's a new world. And the new world lacks actually a lot of the intellectual issues that you require in the messy world. I mean, a lot of the issues today are not around the calculating. They're around, can I abstract this problem in a way that will actually produce a real result? I mean, take the pandemic. Really messy, right? Now, can maths help with that? I certainly hope it could. You know, can it model how we do things better? But then we can misinterpret it, and you can see all the different interpretations. Sometimes experts, I mean, there are very many good experts who've said very sensible things, but sometimes experts have come up and they've said things that I think are far too specific. They cannot predict. They don't know a particular, they know a range of possible outcomes. They don't know the specifics because it's too complex. And so if you inject that into a population who have no idea about computational thinking, you can get them very skeptical of working anything out. You can get them very skeptical of some of the positive outcomes that maths can produce because everything seems like garbage when some of the experts have been too specific. So you need a population that really understands what makes sense, what doesn't make sense at some level, what they can interpret in a reasonable way. And
now you're jumping right to chapter 11, utopianism. So let's talk about your utopianism, your end game here. You talk about how one of the great achievements that we don't talk about very often is the fact that we had compulsory education around reading and writing. And at one point in history, like almost all of human history, we were illiterate, except for the priests and the princes and the princesses. And that was about it. And maybe they're scientists in their little towers. But you said, and people thought it might be an impossible job. In fact, they were pretty convinced it was impossible to make the great unwashed masses literate, but they did it. Okay. And you said that's one of our greatest achievements. And now the next great hurdle is what?
So I would call that literacy, or it became called literacy. I think we've now got an achievement of computational literacy. That's in a sense, the equivalent that we now have to achieve. And the picture is actually quite similar if you think about it. We've got an elite, so to speak, who are versed in this. We've got a small number of, you know, high-level data scientists, people in control of a lot of data, people in control of modeling. And we're basically, most of the population are left to sort of say, well, I've got to believe what I'm being told, or completely reject it, because they've got no wherewithal to be able to assess it. They haven't had the education in it. Just like in the past when we had, you know, priests or aristocrats, as you were describing, saying, you know, this is what is said. You need to believe it because you can't read it for yourself. You can't interpret it for yourself because you haven't been educated and able to do that. And so I think this is a major issue, not just for can we get better jobs for people who are technical? That's important, you know, drives our economy. But it's not just that. It's further than that. It's like when most of the decisions being taken are done on the basis, at least to some extent, of computation, modeling, data science. If you have most people not able to partake in that understanding, they will become suspicious and disconnected from that decision taking. And so it's not surprising to me that in the world we have at the moment, you have people who totally reject what any expert says, however sensible the expert, because they have no ability to be able to connect with that way of analyzing the world. That doesn't mean, by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying every expert at all is right. Every maths person who speaks, some of them talk garbage, some of them don't. But the problem is, if you know, I feel like I've got some ability to make a decision about that. Do I believe what I'm being told, or do I not believe it? I feel somewhat empowered. If I had no computational thinking education, I think I would feel highly disempowered in the modern discourse. And if you look at, you know, what's being discussed now compared to 20 or 30 years ago, it is a vastly more quantitative discussion. I mean, look at the pandemic. We've had graphs put in front of everybody. We've had, you know, percentages, probabilities, you know, what's the risk of a vaccine versus no vaccine versus, you know, 2 vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. We've been thrust into a sort of mass decision-making process beyond any before in sort of general public, in the general public area. And it's become very stark to see who can partake in that and who has real difficulty in that.
Right. And the nature of truth, right, is interesting because I think the way news is disseminated to us, it's looking for shock value, a binary outcome, a litmus test.
Yeah.
You're either loathsome or you're with the clean. You either are an ignoramus or you're enlightened. It's very binary, and as you know, it's messy, right?
Yeah.
And I instead of talking about the pandemic, which I think we're all hit over the head with, and it's an obvious case, I think, and you're right. But in terms of empowering people, you bring up an interesting case of how the banking crisis happened because people were going to their old model of handwriting out equations and not really relying on the computers, which could have given them better data sets. And relate that also, if you could, to how most people don't even understand how compound interest works. So and I hate to say people are victims, but even middle-class people are victims to not having computational literacy.
Yeah, I mean, the banking crisis is interesting, okay? Because I mean, there are many intertwined issues with the banking crisis. But one I wanted to pick out was this, that some folks ended up fitting basically, you know, at school we learn about these normal distributions often, which is a particular way of fitting a curve to data. And if you think about why it's normally done so you can throw out most of the data so that it's easier to work with the model. Why would you throw out most of the data? Well, it doesn't make much sense now. It made sense before when you couldn't calculate with many data points at once because you were doing it by hand. So you had to. There was no other way to do it. So what you did is you approximated the data with some curve, and there were various ways you did this. And the simplest or the most generic of all was the normal distribution. So guess what we tend to teach our students at school? We teach them the normal distribution. There, in fact, in Mathematica, I think there are something like 150 generic other distributions with all different shapes and types and everything else. So why it should be the normal distribution is question one. But question two is actually why you'd use a distribution and when you want to use a distribution anyway. Wrong process, wrong way to do it, you know, all pushed because the assumption in the education system is you need to know how the tool is built before you're allowed to use the tool. Therefore, you don't get to very many tools to use. Therefore, often you use the wrong tool for the job. And in the banking crisis, a bunch of people, when they were fitting, you know, they should have used long tail distributions at least, if not done other analyses. They used normal distributions, and they got completely the wrong risk profiles for what they were analyzing. And that was one factor in what happened with the banking crisis in 2008. The bigger picture here is this. There's this saying, you know, a bad workman blames his tools. I don't know what it's a saying in the US, it's certainly a saying in the UK. Actually, I think in the modern world, it's more like, you know, a bad workman or a bad work person, one should say, doesn't know their tool set, doesn't apply, you know, doesn't use the full set of tools for the job. And that's very much the case with math. So at school, because we're obsessed with teaching people how to calculate, how to do the mechanics of the tool, we don't teach them very many, a tiny fraction of what's available, and mostly not modern tools either, because they depended on computers. And of course, none of the computer stuff has really got into the curriculum, like machine learning, for example. So they learn a very small fraction of tools. So then they come out from the outside world, and if they ever apply their math at all, they go and say, okay, right, normal distribution, quadratic equations, those are the sort of tools I knew. And so they try to fit those tools to the job. And it's a bit like, if you're doing DIY, you say, right, you're not allowed to use a screwdriver till you've learned to make a screwdriver. You're not allowed to use a hammer before you've learned to make a hammer. Taking the latter as an analogy, it's not surprising most problems look like a nail if all you've got to use is a hammer.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so that's sort of a summary of why people have tended to do the wrong thing often, and why our education is doubly negative in that sense, because it's actually not even exposing what they could be doing, let alone giving them the impetus to go and use the mathematics, because they don't see the relevance of it in many cases either.
Right. You've suggested that a lot of I worked in education for years, and now where we sell to schools a learning tool. So I'm selling to teachers and having to communicate a kind of value proposition to teachers. So I'm seeing from the other end of things. But you said that teachers, especially lower grade teachers, teach the math that they use themselves. And they might not be conscious of that, but you said we use the reading and writing because that we learned in school because we have to. We're always reading and writing, right? But the only math we're really using tends to be the stuff we learned before maybe third or fourth grade, right? Yeah. And I think it's very interesting. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the stock question I have for people, most of us have learned how to solve a quadratic equation at school. Mm-hmm. I don't know how old we are, what grade it is, but, I suppose here it's something it's always hard to remember where you learn things, but I don't know, age 9 or 10 or something in where I am, maybe a bit older. I wonder how many of us have actually ever used a quadratic equation for anything other than to help our children do quadratic equations at school, right?
Right.
And I've asked this question of many countries, many ministers of education and so forth around the world, and I've never got a good answer. So that's a good example of a case where it seems irrelevant to most kids why they would do this. It isn't actually relevant. It isn't the best thing to be learning. The real question is, when would you use equations? There are, as you mentioned earlier, differential equations. There are third, fourth order equations, which are polynomial. There are many sorts. It's how do you set that up in the abstract stage? How do you use it? How can you compute really powerful problems with that? Not how do you solve that one very specific sort. So that's an example where most of our math teachers have learned that at school, of course. They're being told to teach it. If you really drill down into why are they teaching it, I can come up with all sorts of reasons, but actually when you boil it down, it isn't a practical thing that kids are using afterwards when they go into the real world. So whereas if you look at, let's say, what people learn in English or the local language classes, so to speak, I think they tend to use better phraseology, better writing skills, all the things you start honing when you get older and get more into writing. You go on using those and you use those in all the other subjects. But math, it kind of cuts off at, arithmetic, perhaps a percentage increase, maybe compound interest if they understood that far in the curriculum, etc. So we need to change that. We need to have a math curriculum that all the way up seems like it's something you'd get to use. If you think it's a mainstream subject, I mean, I'm okay with a complete, one of the things I say in the book is, I had to do ancient Greek at school briefly and Latin. Now, actually, I quite enjoyed ancient Greek, right? But I wouldn't force the world's population to learn ancient Greek. I'm fine with people doing any subject they find interesting, or even being pushed a little bit to
now, let me stop you right there, because we homeschooled our boys, and they learned Latin, church Latin, and not ancient Greek, but Koine Greek, like the Josephus Greek, Greek of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And I never thought for a second I wanted to become fluent in the subject. The reason why we did it was because we believed in this idea of the tools of learning, that going deep in a difficult subject is a mental exercise, right?
Yeah.
And it would probably most likely make them more discriminating on their own English, because they had to decline and conjugate these ancient languages, which, are very precise languages, as you know. So that's why we did it. And your Latin teacher had a great thing he said. He said there are really great many reasons why we should study Latin, probably more reasons why we shouldn't. And I just love.
It was actually my science teacher who said it, but about Latin, right?
I thought that's a really honest. It's a Latin teacher. Okay, so it's your science teacher who said it. And it's funny because science, of course, the Linnean system is all Latin. And, Americans we're so funny because we read Harry Potter and we're like, that's so clever how she did that. But it's Latin school and all the spells were learning Latin, which I thought was very funny. So you had this beautiful education. You went to the dragon school when I suppose they allowed the Dons at Oxford to breed, and they opened their own school in the mid 19th century. I love learning about that. I didn't know that. And you didn't know your teachers' names until they died because in their obituaries, because they use nicknames for the teachers. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, all the teachers use nicknames for each other. So you really didn't know. And I mean, you just know. I mean, I had a geography teacher called Splash. And Splash was a guy with a fairly large beard. He was a fairly large guy altogether. And his name was Splash to everyone. I think the history of that was, 20 years before he'd fallen into the swimming pool, and it was fairly large Splash. And so it's how he got named. But you'd go into assembly and the headmaster, who was known as Inky, would tell you, you need to go and see Splash today if you're going to, go and do. So anyway, I think Splash unfortunately died at some point. I think I discovered he was Mr. Blackburn. But yeah, I mean, this was the best of the British style, which I'm afraid is rather drained out now, mostly, sadly. I mean, it's all got rather sort of formalized and professionalized.
Right.
I mean, the Dragon School was an extraordinary place. And it had, I remember, for example, the buildings were pretty bad by modern standards. They'd been drilled out by generations of mostly boys who had made holes in them. But the thing was, it didn't really matter. The point wasn't let's have lovely buildings. The point was let's have great teachers who were interesting. And we had a lot of those, and they didn't have much of a curriculum. Well, apparently the Dragon School was a complete muddle, right? Apparently it was a place where, but actually the teachers were mostly Oxford or Cambridge graduates, which was very unusual for primary school. They were people who just thought of things on their own and were like trying to slightly break rules and things like that. And so they pushed outside what they were supposed to do. And you had very interesting lessons. I mean, they weren't necessarily on, and in the end, you learned quite a lot. And then slotted in with that was the formal stuff you needed to get to your next school. But that was the ethos. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to do that in the modern world anywhere, because we're tied down by these exams that are very, very prescriptive. And people mostly think, most people feel like they need to opt in, they need to get to college, they need to do these things. And so it's very difficult for most people to break out of that. And, and I think that's a great pity, because I think a lot of what I learned, places like Dragon School, were things that had nothing to do with the actual specific subject at that moment. It was to do with how people act, how you persuade somebody of an argument. Can you argue with your teacher appropriately enough that you get allowed to do something that you thought you weren't going to be allowed to do? That kind of thing, as much as, did I learn specifics of shading in geography, how to shade around a road or something.
Right.
I think the thing about Latin is interesting, okay, for the following reason, because I think I could make a better case for compulsory Latin. I'm not going to make this case, and I wouldn't, but I could make a better case for it than I could for some of the mathematics we're currently doing. And that's a very sad reflection. But in a sense, there's a good argument. I mean, the argument I would make for Latin, which you sort of put, is that actually, if you want to learn more details about your own language, English in my case, which is sort of based on Latin, when you've got a language that you intrinsically know through having learned it as a child, it's actually quite difficult to zoom out and see it for its constituent parts.
Exactly.
And hard to analyze. If you go and learn Latin, it's an alien language to you, and it's also very well systematized, and you can see those structures. So I can pick out, the subjunctive in English because I learned it in Latin. Now, is that the most important thing to learn? Probably not. But is it a useful way to, sort of see something from outside, learn how to expand, how to abstract things in your mind? I think it's not unuseful. Are there better ways? Probably. But what's worse of all is to just grind people through a procedure that is neither very intellectual nor do they actually need. And that's what worries me about quite a lot of the current math school curriculum. That's what we've ended up doing with the best of intentions, but that's what we've ended up doing often.
Right. Now, what's interesting is you gave a TED Talk in 2010 where you kind of threw the gauntlet down, essentially. right? And it was
Yep.
it was about, and it was a precursor to the book, but basically it was a summation of what you were getting yourself into by saying that there's two maths, right? And you argued for a digital, not digital, but a computer computational based mathematics. And at the same time, the Soviet Union had recently fallen 10 years before, 12, 13 years before. And a country called Estonia, which is a neighbor of Russia, made it, they had the power to just make these decrees. And they said, well, we'll be the first digital economy. Okay. And more or less, they became the first digital economy because they just made it a proxy. They had to do it. So their medical, their voting, everything was on a, if I'm getting this right, they're to try to make everything digital.
Yep.
And then they said, well, let's make our education the best in the world. And their idea was very interesting because they said, we want the smartest children. All right. We don't just want, they prescribed the teachers what they have to teach. In fact, they gave teachers unprecedented freedom to teach how they wanted to teach. And the results were, and I might have this wrong, but they were tops in Europe, and they were only under like Singapore and a few other Asian countries worldwide. And everyone was like, well, where's Estonia? I thought it was the Finnish that were so great, but the Estonians were just like killing it. Could you describe to us your relationship with Estonia? Because soon after your speech, were you approached? Is that true?
Yeah. Look, Estonia is a very impressive place. I mean, and it's also, I mean, personally, I found the Estonians, so far as I've worked with them, really, it's very enjoyable to work with them in all sorts of ways. No, what happened was we started to put on a conference after the TED Talk at some point in London, actually. We thought we'd try and gather people together who are interested in this. And the Estonians, unlike virtually most other countries, sent somebody, from their Ministry of Education. Mm-hmm. And so we got talking to them, and they basically, I mean, this is cutting a long story short, but fundamentally, their minister at the time, who was a PhD physicist, at some point there was a meeting, and we were trying to persuade him this was a good idea. And he said, well, I got it. I don't need persuading, it's a good idea. The question is how to do it. Right. So, right. I mean, that's the level at which they're operating. A guy used to run their technical university, who was part of the early changes in Estonia and had later come back and become education minister and things, had, got it, physics PhD, right? I mean, that was the level. And unfortunately, I wish I could say that for the UK, and we have similar things in the US, right, at level in terms of making those decisions. Now, to be fair, I mean, Estonia is a small place, right? It's like, I think it's 1.5 million people. So,
but your point was he wasn't a technocrat. He was definitely, he was somebody who came out of the real sciences, not even the academia, absolutely, but the real sciences. And so he knew how things work.
He knew how things work. And again, Estonia, and so I'm going to deconvolve a couple of things you said, because there's the PISA tests, which test different countries around the world. Mm-hmm. And some people like PISA tests, some people less like it. There are issues with it. I think it's done some good things, some bad things, but it's some sort of ranking. Mm-hmm. And most countries, I think the US worries less about it. Most countries worry about where they are on the PISA ranking, and it tests them in math. It turned out that Estonia, independent of everything we did, was very high on the PISA rankings. Right?
Already.
Much higher than the US or the UK.
Already, before you. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But they still thought, you know what? The fact that we're high doesn't mean that we stop and just sit down and do. So they were very early with coding, mm-hmm, and then they were very interested in this. And so one of the things they said to us at the time was, this minister said, Aviksa is his name, said to us, I don't want you to look at our current curriculum. I want you to take a part of it, probability and statistics, for a couple of age groups, and I want you to just imagine what you could make assuming a computer, which is our assumption, assume a computer exists, mm-hmm, and build a curriculum based on that assumption. So we started building this out. We had to design how to do it. We worked with a lot of Estonians. And so we built a number of modules, as we call them, to try and manifest that. And I mean, I just think the whole approach was very good, which wasn't like, you've got to fit with what we've done before and you've got to do this. It was like, nope, you're not allowed to see it even. So we successfully piloted that. Now, even in Estonia, governments change. People have different things, different priorities are pushed. I don't think there's ever been a negative about what we've done, but it wasn't pushed as hard. So we're coming bound, around again for a second push to see if we can really get this pushed away from just the sort of piloting schools that were working with this.
But there was some scholarship done, right? There was a bit of scholarship about the results.
Yeah, a bit, not as much as I would have liked. I would have liked a real,
Sure.
test before, test afterwards in different ways, figure out what we've exactly done. But I think the overall things were quite interesting. One was that people who'd done our computer-based maths actually did no worse on the traditional tests, but they did a lot better on various skills that would test, so to speak, what we would consider true computational thinking for modern sorts of problems. So that was exciting to us. I wish we'd be able to, and we're still working on some more definitive ways to kind of lock that down.
So go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing to say. One of the big problems we've got, much of what's discussed about using computers in education is how to improve the pedagogy, not the subject. Now, when you want to improve the pedagogy, you can test with the same exams and you can decide that actually you did better or worse. The problem about the subject changes, I don't think the subject matter of what's in math tests is right. I think it's testing many of the wrong things. So therefore, if you set those same tests to the people, it's not going to figure out whether they've done any better. So one of the difficulties is one wants to change the assessments. One of the things we hadn't done as far in Estonia as I would like to have done is to roll in the change of assessment formally with the change of subject, so we could really see that before and after in a useful way.
That was what I was going to ask you, because it seemed to me like sometimes you have to flip the question and say, well, because you had answered someone else in another interview and you said, I can't promise that a child that goes through my ideal curriculum would actually test better in differential equations or in calculus, because we're not going to emphasize quadratic formulas and pre-calculus things like it does right now. So, which at first sounds like, ooh, no, because we're so, about that magic door that you have to go through to get into engineering and the STEM disciplines, right? But what I went to is this, like, why wouldn't you have, and you probably do, have your own assessment tool, and you can give it to those kids who study pre-calculus and have them take your assessment tool, right? Is that what you're suggesting? Because I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, and we've been working on this somewhat, and we need to do more work on it. And I would love to get some more projects with like states in the US, for example, who would really like to. I mean, one of the difficulties with this is, we can come up with a test and we can do some work on this. Actually rolling it out anywhere in some way that's somewhat useful is quite difficult. Where you've got, because it's kind of like, in most school systems, if you're outside, folks like you are homeschooling, for example, there isn't enough space even to do something extra because it doesn't count for the normal grades. And so many schools will lock out really doing much extra, or it'll just be a few folks at the top end who just, who were very good anyway and wanted to take an extra club or something. And that's great. I mean, I'd love them to do this, right? But it's not really finding out what we want to find out for most people. And so it's been quite challenging to find ways to actually try this in practice. And again, if you take the schools you were talking about in the UK, the sort of Harry Potter-like schools that I went to, famous British private schools, you'd think they would have the space to do this. They've certainly got plenty of resource. But what's happened over the last few years is that the parents often are so pushy for like an A star in every single subject that all the extra time that would have got spent on extracurricular things like this has ended up kind of being absorbed into just sort of making them A star at traditional mathematics. And so again, you don't get much space for these other things to get airtime. So that's, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think one thing we're working on, and we've worked on a lot actually during the pandemic, is to make everything online, to move it out. And we're starting to do a Wolfram certification program so that people can come and actually just try stuff with us. And that's early stage, but you can already start to do that. And we'll have rollout of more in a few weeks. We've got some online modules that you can go to at Wolfram U. And so it's a small amount of what we've got there, but I think it's a start. And I would like to go on offering this much more, because we're seeing people come to us and say, actually, I don't know why you guys at Wolfram aren't doing more of this, right? Because actually we've slightly lost faith in some of the traditional governmental assessments to figure out what we're doing. And actually a certification from you in computational thinking or data science might be more useful in many ways, might help us more.
I think I've heard you answer this question, and I didn't like your answer because I'm selfish. So I'll ask it again. But over in Amazon, they have their space program, right? And their rockets are called the New Glenn rocket, right after John Glenn. And I'm thinking, and I like thinking about like the Tesla, the SpaceX project of just going to Mars, just doing it, hiring not just NASA types, but also people who build water towers, just to get those things built and get them up and going back to first principles. Why in the world wouldn't you do a New Dragon school and just have some kind of like University of Chicago had the famous lab school. In Illinois, we have IMSA, which is a very elite school. If you know about IMSA, Illinois Math and Science Academy. And these are very elite schools, and people just expect, well, they're going to do that IMSA thing over there. That's like Hogwarts. They're just crazy smart kids, like Wolfram types, right? But you want to democratize this. You're saying everyone. You're not saying an elite school. Why can't there be a New Dragon school that could be an exemplar, a model of like what the New Dragon graduate looks like?
Well, look, I think there's several things. It's not a bad. I mean, I think it's a valid criticism of what we haven't done. Okay, to some extent, but I'll tell you what. I don't think we're particularly good at. I don't think our forte is going to be running a school. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that's where we're optimized. Okay, and I think there are folks who are really good at the process of that. And I think what we're trying to do now actually is work with some people who are running school systems who are very innovative and try and work with them on this. And I think that's. I think, but the net effect is the same, whether we're running it, somebody else running it. The point is, what you're saying is, why not inject this into a setup in schools that is prepared to just be totally different? Now, the thing about the Dragon School at the time, the Dragon School does fit with the traditional exams. It did get people into their next school. It did prepare them with fairly traditional, although at that level of primary school, you get fewer of these exams. Right. So actually, it wasn't out of the system. And also, it was operating in the 70s and 80s when I was there in a system that was far less prescriptive on exams. So I think the difficulty we've got in general now, although I think actually I'm slightly hopeful this is changing for the better, but the difficulty we've got is it's a very tiny fraction of families, of parents, of students who want to literally opt out of the current, system of assessments and everything. And, the difficulty is you can't find a big enough cohort who really says, really screw it. I really don't care. In the end, if the college doesn't like me because I didn't get the traditional assessments, screw the college. I'm going to do something else. There are people who do that. And many of them are incredibly talented. I just don't think it's a very large number in one place who are prepared to go into one cohort. Now, I think the US actually in many ways is the leader in this, because I think there are more people who are either homeschooling or in their own setup of schools. In some countries like Germany, as I understand, it's actually illegal to homeschool things. So you actually really are locked in.
It was a Hitler law, I think. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it may be, I think it has actually, my understanding of it is there are some quite positive reasons for it in not allowing people to opt out of some of the history.
The historical pedigree is it was a during right after.
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. It is the way around I'm talking about. Yeah. Right. So there are reasons for these things, and they're somewhat rational. But I think so. Yes, I mean, I like what you're saying. I think we're not quite the right people to do it by ourselves, but we're very, very excited about working with folks who want to do that. And I think there's a real appetite for that, particularly in the US right now, where people just want to go around the system in order to solve the problem. In some cases.
There are colleges in the United States that are becoming insolvent. There's no students. Oftentimes they have the money, but there's no students, or other way around. But usually it's people aren't going to school. Boys aren't going to college like they used to. There's a kind of a political crisis in the schools right now. And I think that it would be interesting if you found schools like MIT or some of the top schools for engineering, against the STEM, for instance, who'd say, we would take a student who had this model of education. We'd track them in. And then, so I just think that
is a huge driver.
Yeah.
And I wish that's a reasonable criticism. We haven't, in a sense, allied, particularly the university admissions folks, to the point, or major schools. And we were starting to do this a bit actually in the UK, so that they could say, because that's where I'd like to be, in the end, if the top universities would say, for your engineering course, actually, we'd prefer this sort of computer-based math approach or this computational thinking approach to what's traditionally been done that would actually help you, that would obviously be a tremendous driver for many people to start to take this approach. And then I think that would then filter down to people who were not particularly going to apply for engineering at MIT, but were going to apply for something, you know, less technical at a less high-ranking place. So I think actually that would be really positive. But again, it's quite hard to do that. I mean, you know, universities around the world, I think, are a little bit entrenched in what they do, and I think that's actually been shown up a little bit, you know, in the last 18 months. And I would love to see that move forward. And I think some of the, you know, less famous universities actually may be able to really zoom ahead here in doing things that are very innovative.
We're talking about disruption, right? And that's what we're talking about. And I think that what people are very susceptible to, for the good or the bad, is art. And you have an art background, you did some graphic art, and you know that art's a powerful thing. And I'm talking about, now I'm going to talk about Hollywood art, where, and we were talking on another podcast, and I said, I'm going to be talking to you. And I kept thinking about the Kobayashi Maru. Are you aware of the Kobayashi Maru?
Not in, I've heard the name, but I can't.
The Kobayashi Maru is the famous test where there's no win solution. And Captain Kirk was the only person in Star Trek who ever won it because he coded. He went in and computed he recomputed the computer so he could win. So he used computational knowledge and literacy to beat the test, to cheat the test. And but my point about this is there are so many people who don the uniform of Federation or Marvel or whatever. People have quite an imagination, right? And people would kill if they can go to a school that was like the Federation Academy. If you said, this is a school for the 21st century, it's the 21st Century Academy, and we're teaching Star Trek level kind of stuff, where it's scenario thinking, and we've gamified, and there's virtual reality, and kids are put into situations, scenarios that are hairy and messy and unwinnable, and they're forced to orally defend things to maybe an AI tutor who's actually Plato or Aristotle. Right. So there's so much, I think, where the computers will come into their own in the next 20 years. We're going to have these virtual reality, absolutely impeccable, gamified scenario situations. So I see you and your ideas plugging right into that. What do you think about that?
I completely agree. I mean, one of the problems at the moment is, you know, we've got a new industrial revolution that's hit us or is hitting us, or we're in the middle of it, how to define it, you know, fourth industrial revolution, whatever, AI age, as I prefer it to be termed. Previous industrial revolutions had some of the similar effects, but a big difference. So they were mostly to do, as I put in the book, about brawn rather than brain. They were mostly, you know, could we not physically, you know, sow seeds in the field, but have a tractor to do it instead or whatever. But what they did do, which was similar, is they elevated the human to have to do something more sophisticated, actually. You know, rather than go and plant a seed repetitively, you're now managing a farm type of thing. So the similarity here is I want people to go up to the next level and to use what quintessentially human powers of imagination and, you know, creativity, and I think have more fun doing that. I want them to do it with a bigger tool set, with a bigger canvas, to put it in an artistic way. And I think that the computational thinking canvas is an extension. It's not the only way of thinking about life, but it is an extended way of thinking that gives you more power with an extended tool set, you know, which is sort of the AI tool set, the computing tool set. And so what we really need people to do is we need them to step up on this level. Now, what's tricky this time is that, in a sense, we're trying to share intelligence with these machines. So that's a very different sharing than we did in previous industrial revolutions. And that's something where it's sort of closer to what's considered quintessentially human. And so that's tricky. That's tricky psychologically. It's also tricky to know how to interact with the machine so you don't get fooled by it. Right. I mean, we want the human to be in charge of the machinery, so that we can have the machinery do what us as the human race want to do better, so to speak, make better decisions. What we don't want is to turn that into a thing where effectively the machinery is driving what we do. We want to be the managers of the machinery. And so that's a tricky thing to achieve. And I think all of these aspects where you've got creativity, things that end up as quintessentially human things, art is very much in that category of all sorts. Projects that drive these things in education, which go across many traditional subject boundaries. I think those are going to, in a sense, pull through those high-level human qualities much more than stratifying each thing to these sort of rigid subjects that we all have to learn and
Right.
take tests in. So I think that's for that reason, I think this is a very positive approach. I mean, one warning I would say on this, I think I'm very positive about much of the work that's been done about, I forget the word, but where you're learning by doing, so to speak, both the maker movement and
experiential learning.
Yeah, that Seymour Papat's work and so forth.
Right.
But I do think you do actually, I mean, for things like mathematics and the structure of it, there's so much there. You do actually have to step back and learn formally some things, because otherwise you don't know what the tool set is you can work with.
Right.
So I feel there's a sort of iterative process that you need between doing projects, learning more tool set, both formally and informally, doing more projects and working with it. And I don't completely go with the idea that you can do everything experientially, purely experientially, so to speak. So there's a mixture there, but we've got to go far more over to these real world, messy, experiential approaches.
Right. Two things about that. The Chinese, my friend has told me, the Chinese, I said, why don't we put EKGs on kids' heads and test their insulin levels when they're in school and study them almost like rhesus monkeys and really learn like where the optimum time of the day is, when they should get a shot of insulin in their sugar, like, when are they optimally learning? When are they really should be just doing passive work because they're tired, whatever. And he goes, oh, the Chinese are doing that. They have EKGs in the kids' heads and they're studying them like crazy, which sounds, because the Chinese are doing it, sounds a little insidious, right? But I still think that the science is, why aren't we applying this kind of science to children like we would with astronauts? You've seen the famous pictures of the astronauts with all the EKGs and they're making them like, and the second point is this. Everybody would have the same answer. If you put an EKG on a kid's head and study their brain waves, right? From the day they wake up, the time they wake up to they come home from school and they get on their PlayStation, when is the biggest spike of engagement? Right?
Yeah,
obviously,
it's going to be the gameplay.
This is the gameplay. Why? And there's lots of people who make these games, who know human psychology, know how to engage. Yeah. And these kids are also, the second point is this. These kids, whether, you and I are kind of like of that generation, we're a little bit older, right? But these kids are born, their normal is they're working inside of a machine. They're working in an environment, right? So they're already doing it. They're already very comfortable working and negotiating a digital space, right?
Yeah. No, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is, I totally agree about those things. But to me, we've got to strip very carefully away the what it is they're trying to learn, right, and need to learn, which, by the way, includes, how you operate machines and all that thing. It's important, from the way in which they're trying to learn it. Mm-hmm. So people say to me, can't you just gamify mathematics and it'll be more fun and everything else? And it's like, let's strip this away. Step one is, let's get the right damn subject with the right content that is what people actually basically need.
Right.
Once we've got that, let's figure out the right way to deliver it, so that our students can have the most fun and engage most in actually, in actually, getting that learning effectively. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, what a lot of people run off with is, oh, it's great, we can gamify, solving a quadratic equation, right? Well, no, that's not what we want. I mean, yes, it'll make it more fun than sitting at a textbook doing it, perhaps, but so what? Right. And, so I think we've got to be very careful mixing those two issues. But I mean, should we have learning in the way it's currently done in many places, where the sort of somebody stands up and talks about it? No, that seems kind of nuts, and we can do much better than that. And I think the role of teachers is very important to think about. I mean, as I often say, I think I said in the book, teachers, in my view, are the CEOs of the classroom, or they should be. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't be the fountains of all knowledge. That era has gone. We can look knowledge up on the web. Right. We don't need a teacher to know everything about what they're teaching. Just like I don't know everything that everyone here is doing, right, in managing a company. What I know about is how to engage them better to do their piece of the job. I know certain things where I need to think a lot at a high level, some things where I look at details. I'm trying to knit it all together, not know every fact. And so I think teachers are really critical in this. But I think we need to give them a bit more confidence to be able to go out of the box and say they don't know. say they have no idea what the answer to this question is.
Right. Right. We're at the end of our time, but I want you to tell the audience, please, where they can go to learn more, besides your book, of course, which is easily found on Amazon. Where can they go to find more online about the modules, about where they can sign up, maybe to put in a petition to their local school board or to get a hearing? What could they do?
So go to computerbasedmath.org.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, you'll find a few links. One of them is to the Wolfram U, and there are some modules we put up on under computational thinking on the Wolfram U page. That's where you can find some modules to try. You'll also find the petition that we've lodged that says basically there are some things that we think everybody can agree around, and if we can unify around those, we think we'll have a much more powerful message to take to governments and others about what needs to change here, rather than them getting lots of disparate messages from different people about the change that's needed. At Wolfram, we've got many other facets of this as well. Some people might get very interested in coding in its own right and programming. We've got some great great ways to engage with that. We've got a site called Demonstrations, which has, I think, pretty out of date now, but it was 10,000 different interactive demonstrations that you can try from all areas of science and also write your own.
They even have Ceres linkages. That's what we. So
oh yeah, those are fantastic.
We love we use that in our business demonstrations projects. It's an
that's great.
Amazing
well, that's
tool.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's an amazing.
So I should look yours. I didn't think of looking yours up before.
Look us up.
So and please engage with us. The other thing we're running increasingly, we've got summer schools, we've got other courses, other things, other programs to engage with. We'll be stepping that up over time. So, please keep looking back at that. And
is that for kids of all ages or teenagers?
Yeah, certainly teenagers and above, and and professionals as well. But also sometimes for younger kids as well. So we're trying to sort of uptick all of that at the same time. And of course, if you are somebody who's, in charge of a large organization or part of government or something like that, please engage with us. We would love to work with you on building, a computational thinking program in your organization or your state or whatever, to try and move this along. And so we're really interested in that top-down approach as well as helping people sort of bottom up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on my show, Conrad. It's been
great to be, and it's been a really fun discussion.
Yeah. And thank you for doing what you're doing. We really appreciate over here. You definitely have a beachhead in Galesburg, Illinois. We're pro what you're up to, and we'll talk soon. Okay.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you, sir. Take care. Bye-bye.